We've abstracted split assets and liabilities so many times into smaller and smaller assets and lies to unprecedented levels. Optimize, make more efficient, optimize again, make more efficient. But at what cost? Then some geniuses repackaged those fragments of assets and liabilities and bundled them up and called them CDOs and MBS, and those two were sliced, diced, trenched, tranched, repackaged and flogged for all they're not worth. It was a good idea in the beginning when they were quality assets, but then I suppose the commissions and getting rid of toxic assets was just too appealing. On a practical level, commoditization is now so efficient, it's cheaper, faster and more convenient to buy another one than have it fixed, repaired, or in the cases of crafts, sharpened or maintained. Throw away those old chisels, throw away those old saws, power drills, drill bits. Just buy new ones, it's cheaper, faster. But at what cost? It's something I've also heard from criminal investigators. They say you have to widen the frame to see what's really going on. If you only take a narrow view, an action, an occurrence can look perfectly legitimate. Or in the case of our topic of discussion for the moment, the 1350, it enables one to draw conclusions that are spurious and harmful and insidious. We might ask, why is there such a disparity between violent crime when we look at the stats between men and women, black or white? And it's younger black men that are also coincident in those stats on violent crime. So, widening the frame. What would happen if we solved the social issue that has the effect of young men, black or white, doing less violent crime? Wouldn't that be a better question to ask? I mean, I presume prevention is better than cure. For all the people we do find guilty of a violent crime and lock away, the victim doesn't always get to walk away, and families are torn apart. And the costs are incredibly high. If we could find a way to alleviate social factors that increase criminality and violence amongst young men across the board, that would also, I presume, disproportionately affect young black men, if 1350 is true. Hence, we need a good understanding of cause and effects, as mentioned, to be able to look for solutions. So let's just skip the blame. We can get to that after the fix if we really want to. So some studies have even shown that a pound or a dollar spent on social programs returned 6 or 7 times. For any investor, that's a no-brainer all day long. But here is the dirty little secret. While these social programs do return equity to the community via less crimes, safer neighbourhoods, better working conditions, more opportunities, it means less people in those prisons, where single owners of those prisons concentrate that cash flow. Rather than it being dispersed into the community, it's funneled into the private prison system. So it's a complicated question and goes back to things like prohibition, the war on drugs. You know, it's a wide topic, and just keeping it narrow for a second to crowbar in a conclusion. But what if all these laws are actually contributing to or criminalising behaviours that lead to a very high prison population? The counter-argument is, some drugs we can make legal and tax them and use the taxation to pay for whatever, social programs, getting people off the drugs. Seems a bit counterintuitive, but here we are. Same with cigarettes and tobacco. I mean, if we're going to ban certain drugs, then ought we not ban all drugs? Or complicated. Lots of nuances, and I won't even pretend to be able to go through any of them here. But the point I'm making is, just to quote facts, or just quoting government stats, bruh, are often heard. The very same people who say those are often heard, whispering, "Oh, the left, you people, you get so triggered when I'm simply stating the facts." Yeah, because it's disingenuous practice and conveniently leaves out a lot. I find these kind of inflammatory statements, so they're not actually wanting to enter a dialogue. They are doing it for outrage, they're doing it for the grift, they're doing it to get eyeballs, they're doing it to get monies off the YouTubes. But it also leaves behind a trail, and it infers that the other side of the genetic environment argument, by sweeping away the environmental side, And then they leave this association of thuggery and violence or low IQ with their genetic link. That's just the way they are. That's the inference, and it's spurious. And once pegged to they, blame and fault can be assigned. And then all sorts of arguments, rhetoric are constructed to keep them out. So it seems to me that just about everything is political. Any decision that leads to policy is political. Such discussions are raised by people actually interested in providing solutions. It seems to me also those who want to shut down the conversation are just looking to point blame and to end the dialogue so their preconceived conclusions can't be challenged. They can go on with their denial or whatever it is, living the way that they want things, which reminds me, just to inject a little bit of political commentary, it does seem that the right wing is generally motivated by fear of things. I mean, the very notion of being conservative, what are you saving for? What are you protecting? What is it you think you're going to lose? What is this fear of things being taken away? And the further right we find people, it seems the more that they have a hatred of people whose values are not as their own. And if even further right you go, it seems the more of a disgust that they have with people who want to change the society as it exists today. It's about preserving the hierarchy. It's about preserving the power structures. It's about preserving the institutions. Where's the policy in this? So it does become a left-right divide, not arguments about policy, not discussions about solutions, not even discussions about problems. It's just you're on the left, I'm on the right, you're wrong, I'm right. And then this putrid, horrid battle of, denigrating the other, shouting each other down, making up lies, leaving facts out of conversation, misrepresenting one's own position, lying. It's just awful. So impasses can arise here too. So let's say, for example, let's just say we're having a discussion about how corporations are bad. Okay, there are benefits to corporations too, but for the moment, let's just focus on hypothetically why corporations are bad. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, as to whether they are or whether they are not, discussion for another day. But I'm just picking on this one. So we might get a group of people that say, yeah, they are bad because they exploit workers and they seize the means of production. They don't pay people their full value. And another group might say corporations are bad because they're run by some nefarious banking cartel. The elites, whoever it is. The former group might advocate for things like workers' rights as a solution, co-ops as a solution, regulation on wages as a solution, a kind of collectivist approach. The other group might simply want to oust the perceived incumbent powers that be and install themselves as the new powers that be. That doesn't solve the perceived problem of the first group, but it does solve the perceived problem of the second group. They just install themselves as the new power brokers. The first group still got the same grievances. Nothing's changed for us. The second group, well, it's all changed for us because we're in power. And so you see what I'm saying? It's the same perceived problem as stated. Corporations are bad. But the solutions, because of what's being valued, are very different. So the trick, if there is one, seems to be to focus on solutions that are agreed as mutually beneficial, both in the why and how, let's say, cross-party, cross-culture, cross-ideologies, where possible. So let's get those done first. Yeah, so solution-seeking rather than blame-seeking. Because where it's clear that perceived causes to the problem are divided, how can consensus lead to a common solution under such conditions? At the risk of falling into the ad Hitlerium, is it Hitlerarium? Where you devolve a conversation down to, well, that's as bad as Hitler, and by definition, you've lost your argument. Okay, that's so I'd consider, at that time in history, just prior to the Holocaust, the persecuted and the persecutors, one says, this country has a problem with Jews walking in the streets. And the other says, this country has a problem with Jews walking in the streets. I'll leave it to you to work out which was which. And consider the consequences. When stated like this, it's easy for the holders of power to say, see, they agree with us. It's really slimy and it's a filthy tactic. Yeah, back to our 1350 thing. So surely it's not escaped your attention that much of this violent crime takes place in very poor urban areas, the so-called ghettos, the inner city, high levels of gang criminality, high levels of policing, all sorts of covariant factors come into play. Some of those tenement buildings, poorly constructed, lead in the paint, which has had detrimental effects on child development, in combination with poor living conditions and poverty and nutrition being cofactors. Dozens of other effects like this, hence multivariable regression. Analysis is one tool to factor for these, often phrased in the papers or reports as all things being equal, which is I think is a bit of a caveat to acknowledge that there may also be other covariant factors as yet unknown. So interestingly, reading around risk and risk analysis, there has been a difference in how the British and Americans have handled the issue of, say, lead in the environment and how it was perceived as a potential hazard to health. It's a curious divergence, and it stems again from historical attitudes and legal rulings of the past, which shaped the perception of risk in the respective countries' investigative bodies. In the UK, the Royal Commission on Environment Pollution looked at the impact of lead pollution, and with a remit of specific problems in fuel at the time, and to deliver recommendations for further research and policy. The whole shebang. Everything was looked at. A bit of science, a bit of risk assessment, analysis, and recommendation of public policy. The US, the focus was much more on expert judgments concerning the mean IQ reductions at varying levels of exposure to lead. Very specific and very narrow. The UK Royal Commission had access to many, many studies previously done by other bodies, and their conclusion was that there may be a link between lead pollution and psychometric indices, or the co-founding factors, or both. Impossible to say. And they made a curious comment that they thought it unlikely that population surveys alone will settle the issue in the near future, as evidence at hand showed at the most small behavioural intelligence effects at the concentrations found in the general population. Well, that's a wide enough scope to sail a battleship through. Yet its recommendation was to phase out the use of manufactured sources of lead in the environment. The chair of the commission realised that there were certain unknowns that they would like to know, but realised they may in fact be unknowable, and they made recommendations based on the bias of dangerous until proven safe. So the Commission used a four-prong approach in its analysis of the risk. Rather than rely on surveys, which it realised were inconclusive, it looked at how lead interferes with living things, particularly human beings. It turns out that there was no level of lead that did not have an effect on RNA, i.e. no level at which no effects were found. So lead always affected RNA at any level. And secondly, they looked at its persistence in the environment. It does not break down, but accumulates. There's two big things saying that if there is no level of lead which does not affect RNA, and when it's found in the environment and continually put in the environment, it only accumulates, the conclusion is almost clear. So that's two bad factors. They then looked at blood lead levels in the general population and levels that are known to have health effects. Turns out that these two levels were disturbingly close to each other, particularly in urban areas. So what might we conclude? If RNA is always affected when lead is in its presence, and the amount of lead is only accumulating in the environment, and when we look at the levels of lead in the population's blood, and then compare that with the level at which we know health effects start to happen and realise that that's already close, it points in one direction. So they looked at how much it would likely cost to remove lead from commercial products. So my take on this is that the Commission realised that there could well be something here, but with so many factors to isolate, one could get bizarre results if this was mishandled. So let's say that it was discovered that some particular location, geographic location in this analysis was shown to have high incidence of low IQ in children. It would be absurd to then tell young parents looking to start a family not to move to that location. It's an abstract fact pulled out of a study on lead pollution. See what I'm saying? So I think they realised that instead of people avoiding certain locations of trying to avoid other confounding factors, the best course of action was just reduce the lead pollution. In other words, they seemed willing to make recommendations with acknowledgement of the uncertainties. This kind of path to this conclusion follows the criteria for a risk assessment I've highlighted once or twice on the channel before. They identified a hazard, the specific health hazards, the pervasiveness, hazard factors, the environmental persistence, catalyst effects, and the concomitant results, which in this case were not actually specifically identifiable. So the verbiage of the effect on health to children was qualitatively at the most small. What does that even mean? The US approach was actually to quantify what that meant. I mean, of course, they actually had their own research and own teams working on the problem, but the emphasis was more akin to how much lead poisoning per IQ point with what probability. Much more quantitative analysis. And for historical reasons, I think it's to do with cases of cancer. The US's system of medical risk insists on bands of risks. Seems in recent years that the UK has picked up this habit for better or worse. The UK is currently using wristbands in its assessment of the COVID threat level 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, we're at level 3. Whatever that means. The idea of banding was to express an accurate sense of the reliability of any projections to the final decision makers. In the case of COVID, you and I are the ultimate decision makers about our own precaution level. So, level 2, level 3. What do you do differently? Well, I don't know about you, but I'm fuzzy on this. I mean, I can see the point that if particular behaviours are ascribed or recommended to each level, it makes communication much faster. If everybody knows what you do when you're at level 1, great. If everybody knows what you need to do at level 2, great. Then all the news people need to say is, we're at level 1, we're at level 2, you know what that means, take it upon yourself to take action accordingly. Makes communication faster. It's like, the defence condition, DEFCON levels. Those in the organisation know what DEFCON 2 means, and they know what procedures need to be enacted and what operational thresholds and states of readiness are required as an appropriate response to each DEFCON level. It makes it really fast, and people drill for it and practice for it, so that on the day when whoever says we're going to DEFCON 3, everyone springs into action, and it's a fluid machine. It knows what it's doing. Everyone knows what that means. DEFCON 2, everyone knows what that means, and it all just comes into action. So it does rely on good risk analysis, situational awareness, and correct and appropriate mapping from the qualitative and quantitative analysis to alert the right level. And it seems to me that, you basically, not only loading a gun at different DEFCON levels, but you're pulling the trigger back, you're making it more easy to fire and, let one off the chain, as it were. So probably why countries around the world that use these kind of DEFCON levels have extraordinary intelligence agencies and immense risk assessment and risk analysis teams churning the data and chomping on it all day long in buildings with 5 sides, that kind of thing. So the UK's policy on lead was adopted with barely any resistance. The US scrutinised things a lot more, trying to figure out what terms like at the most small actually meant. And in the US, turns out, their legal system has a thing called de minimis, which essentially says that if some claim made against another is effectively trivial, then it ought not concern the court's time. So the question then arises, is it a trifling concern or not? At the most small, certainly would seem to say so. But this wording of phrasing wasn't used in the United States anyway. In effect, though, this is what happened. Congress was involved, the EPA was involved, the validity of the methods were reviewed, the Science Agency Board was involved, lawsuits were filed, and in the end the EPA persuaded industry, Congress and the courts and others that its analytical principles were consistent with a scientific approach. Very expensive endeavour. So there certainly does seem to be a very different attitude between us Brits and the Americans in terms of things like rights and risk. Here in the UK it seems a bit more based on reasoned accommodation. Over there it seems a bit more like, well, how bad do you want it? Show me. And you better bring your A game, because I know I have. American regulators, moreover, are subject to much wider system of checks and balances that place them answerable to Congress, courts, as well as the White House. So they have multiple channels of accountability. they are answerable to a much more diverse array of political pressures than are their British counterparts. It certainly seems a historical artefact of how these things are looked at differently. And speaking of history and going back and regressing things, and if we go back far enough, certainly in American crime statistics, we won't find any black crime at all. Turns out, de-citizenizing people and making them slaves precludes them from being a crime statistic. So we might make plans to enslave white young men too? Yeah, it's an absurd example to make the point. I mean, obviously, if we lock everybody up, all the crime's going to be in prison. So what happened then? Long story. Started from the time of emancipation. Well, effectively an apartheid. Then what happened post Jim Crow? The Great Migration, where millions of black people moved from the south to the north. So what might we expect when millions of poor and discriminated against people migrate? Well, they have to find low-cost places to live, commensurate with a low wage. But it wasn't just blacks, but also Asians, Irish and Italians who were in a similar situation. During the early part of the 20th century, there was a massive rise in gang violence and criminality within the Italian and Irish clusters. Organised crime was born. Just think about it for a moment. You'd think you couldn't do it, but when you take a slave wage, live in a shitty shelter, can't afford food, let alone new boots for the job, criminality starts to be appealing. And I've seen it, and I've seen it in people who are not poor. I've seen it in business where CEOs and higher up managers seek to enrich themselves, and these are not desperate people by any means. Yeah, so a while ago I came across a startling documentary called Narco Culture, where drug lords are seen and adored as heroes in the community. Like I say, bringing all the cash, and they actually do spend it on the community, which fosters a lot of good faith with the people. And when it comes to the police showing up, well, no one seems to know anything, but, we got a new school last week, that's all I can tell you. And more than a few people in the community can't wait to be a soldier for the narcos. It's a way out. For some, they see it as the only way out of a bad situation, despite the awful odds. Get rich or die trying. Perhaps not a catching title for a rap song, but more an awareness to a desperate plea. It's not a prescription, but a statement of the sad state of affairs. So around 1915, in Americana land, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act limited and regulated and taxed opium and cocoa-based products. And 10 years later, heroin was outlawed. So already we're starting to put the pieces together. Making it legal won't stop it, just means it's now criminal. On top of that, add prohibition, 1920 to 1933. And in the 1930s, some states legalised limited forms of gambling, mostly lotteries, and specific fund-raising efforts of chance, but mostly gambling was still illegal. In 1931, Nevada seems to have been the big exception. Of course, I hope it's reasonably well known that casinos generally don't help with situations of poverty, unemployment, tax revenues, and actually increase crime, and for better or worse, increase prostitution in the area. Probably problematic where and while the oldest profession is designated illegal, though often, somehow, conveniently, prostitution is legal just over the border to the casinos in the other state or the other country, just over the imaginary line, or in regions close by. See, again, the ass and lies are split. We have an asset, the casino, and the liabilities, well, we'll just push them over the border, but obviously close enough to be in reach of our guests. The gambling town benefits from the Johns flying in to take advantage of vulnerable people in zones just outside the jurisdiction of the actual casinos. So it's not actually the casinos that make the proposition attractive, it's the otherwise illegal activity, exploitation of things otherwise prohibited, just close enough, but definitely outside the border of said gambling towns. And under these circumstances, smaller vendors move out, they can't hack the crime, they can't hack the competition, funny laws get written in preference of hotels and large chain outfits, and of course, in the casino, the house always wins. So, beware of any town, having proposals for casinos, because they'll say, we're going to employ 5,000 people or 500 people, which is great. They do to start off with. And then as time goes by, they're let go and replaced with self-serving gambling machines that don't require any people. And so it isn't a lie. Anyway, with all these factors, gambling, prohibition, making drugs illegal, the markets of the 1920s, 1930s, the imminent Great Depression, you could not design a more fertile grounds for criminal enterprise. And as a side note, in behavioural economics, if you want people to change, never say you can't do this. People will find a way just to prove it can be done, even if they had no mind to previously do it. They will do it. It's better to offer the choice, but to make that choice more difficult than the other option that you want them to adopt. Obscure and make the preferred alternative easier and incrementally different from the behaviour you're trying to swap out. Slippery slopes. What happens when you have a situation where people who like drugs and like alcohol and prostitution and gambling, and then you tell them they can't have it? Oh, black market explodes, and gangs rise, big money's to be made, sophisticated networks of very well operated organised crime spring up. Eventually prohibition ends. By the way, didn't NASCAR have its genesis in the moonshine business? Now, by this time, late 30s, 40s, organised crime was getting big business. And the Italians and the Irish were kind of granted whiteness status and integrated into American culture. And so, who's left out? Still in those ghettos, that's right. They were left to rot in the remnants of criminal enterprises and gang proliferation. So the mafia looked after its own. I'm sure that's no surprise. Again, see narco-culture. And then WW2 came along. And after that, the post-war boom was the foundation for what America would become. Suburbia was built out on the back of this promise. White picket fences, dogs, home ownership, and gardens for everyone. Well, the promise was never really fulfilled. Not that many high-income black suburbs. So, around the 1950s, policies like redlining kept a particular class excluded. Apartheid was still on the books. So this enabled the upward mobility of white folk and the spread of white urban areas. Coloured folk, well, they had their designated places. It was around this time that meaningful crime stats started to be compiled. More recently then, murder in inner city black communities, 55% of it is gang related. In the white community, something like 5%. I even recall when I worked in London during the late 90s, there was a wave of violent crime, black on black crime it was called, but it was just the yardies shooting each other over drug territories. Even expressing it in such a way diminishes it. It's just some yardies. The yardies itself is a derivation from the patois, and patois, well, now we're getting into cultural appropriation. It's, again, so steeped in history. So I remember learning about Creole. I went to university with a guy from Mauritius, and he was telling me a little bit about Creole, and he said most people, even the Mauritius, don't know the rules for it. It's an emergent language. It occurs when people of different nations with no common language are fused together and then forced to work to effect immediate outcomes. A broken language emerges. You do, I do, you fetch, I get. It has tenses of immediacy, and over time, future and past tenses spontaneously arise. It's interesting stuff, but the product of slavery. And I see people on YouTube who want to learn Creole and learn the patois because it's cool, and we continue to use it as a tool of discrimination by using terms like yardie, and it's something to keep in mind. The importance and significance historically of how these languages emerged and what the necessary conditions were that forced their emergence. And we really do have to think about that before we think, you know what, I want to learn that because it's cool. You can see how that's potentially upsetting. Same about the Redskins. We mentioned those covariant regressional analysis and the IQ or genetic question. Well, if we look at the stats and we control for gang-affiliated crimes, the gap between black violent crime and white violent crime narrows significantly, which means that gang affiliation is a more likely explanation of the disparity. So I suppose to complete the story, La Cosa Nostra went on to bigger things, and I suppose mostly it's now to be found in Washington DC, and the small-time crimes of, by comparison, drugs, human trafficking, have been left behind for others to pick up, and who's left in those inner cities to take over those enterprises. Those who made good, either by means fair or foul, moved out of the ghettos, and again this concentrated a particular class of peoples who was left to fill the power vacuum left in the wake of the flight of other groups. Then came the war on drugs. This intensified things, with powerful cartels of the 70s and 80s and a substantial population of drug buyers. The cartels were under threat from the pumped-up law enforcement and cross-border police, with a massively lucrative potential market in the United States. They needed access to a sophisticated and disciplined distribution network within the borders of the United States. They relied on pre-existing and experienced criminal networks. The gangs. The conclusion was inevitable. So, like the mini violent crime wave of the 90s that I mentioned in London, that I heard about, black on black crime isn't some racially perpetuated crime. It's not mindless thuggery. It's not violent dispositions. It's cold, calculated killings, defending turf and distribution rights. It's gang on gang. And remember, some of these gangs are running multi-millions of pounds of dollars per month. You just can't shift that amount of product and wash the money and evade the authorities without at least a modicum of flair for the entrepreneurial, and have street smarts, management skills, astute recruiting practices, forward thinking, expansion plans, know how the police work, know police procedures, have reasonable understanding of the law, robust distribution networks, bribing the right people, having good PR. It's a full-on enterprise. And unlike you or I, if we fuck up at work badly, we get a sack. In these organisations, where millions and millions of pounds of dollars are at stake, fuck-ups are not paid out by liability or professional indemnity insurance. If it's a choice between someone doing 30 years hard time and disappearing someone who's become a liability, well, that's how it is. Dumb criminals are the ones who get caught. Dumb criminals are the ones who think they're smart. And smart criminals know if they, for one moment, become complacent thinking they are smart, then they are also soon in line for the slammer, or worse, to be picked off by the competition or even the home team. So, depending on how we frame this, it was a complete failure of policy by the power structures that made it happen, or it was a perfectly executed plan to make it happen. But as the saying goes, never attribute to malice that which can be explained by incompetence. And in any case, that's the blame game. It's happened, it's done, it's here, it's what we have. However, it points to all the confounding factors. So let's say, generously, for historical reasons, such so-called inner-city communities are ravaged by gangs and high crime, and by choice no one really wants to live there, so rents are low. A higher proportion of revenue flows off book, and employment, officially, is low, and therefore so are tax revenues, which is how schools and public services in the area are funded, and we can see the vicious cycle now in effect. So I hope we can appreciate how useless and insulting and condescending and showing total lack of understanding the phrase "try harder" is. Now, plugging on top the associated and I suppose rational response of law enforcement to patrol more heavily these areas, it makes sense. It's only human nature to make the heuristic associations of relatively high crime with inner city dwellers who happen to be black. And it's just one logical fallacy or cognitive bias to mentally flip this to cause and effect. And then all of a sudden, ghettos don't cause disenfranchised black people to have socioeconomic issues, but mistakenly that type 1 thinking, the fast thinking, produces the thought that because black people live there, it must be them that cause the ghettos. Nature and nurture separated, and cause and effect flipped. Once that mindset takes root, it's very difficult to shift things. We start to ascribe blame, and we put it on black folk to try harder. the heuristic is formed. Why should we give criminal folk special treatment? That's what goes through our minds. I'm going to ask 2 questions now, and I'll probably repeat these 2 questions when we get on to politeness theory, so you probably will already know the answers by then. So anyway, here we go. Question 1. Some people want to increase spending for new prisons to lock up violent criminals. Other people would rather spend this money for anti-poverty programs to prevent crime. What about you? If you had to choose, would you rather see this money spent on building new prisons or on anti-poverty programs? Next question. Some people want to increase spending for new prisons to lock up violent inner-city criminals. Other people would rather spend this money for anti-poverty programs to prevent crime. What about you? If you had to choose, would you rather see this money spent on building new prisons to house inner-city criminals, or would you rather see this money spent on anti-poverty programs? And that's how it happens. See, it's a sneaky inclusion of inner city into that sentence, and because it's a bit of a dog whistle, or what comes to mind when you think of people of the inner city. That's right. So if you changed your mind during those 2 questions, you see how easily it's done. In fact, the 2 questions, when asked, when the survey is done with these 2 questions, it's already a contentious subject, and the number of people for, the number of people against is very close to 50-50. If you leave out inner city, you actually get a slight majority wanting to spend the money on anti-poverty programs. If you put the word inner city in, it swings the balance just enough on the other way. And then you can pour fuel on the fire. What if white folk also know that those tax dollars going to the inner city, that's less for white folk to have nice things over and above a basic need and assured safety, and at least a decent chance at life, starting with half-decent places to live and half-decent schooling. Remember what I said about conservatives have a fear of having things taken away from them. See, it's not isolated now. This is the stochastic terrorism. It's all linked. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. Same here in the UK with the Brexit thing, the way the question was framed. It's all interesting stuff. Socio-economic incentives, behavioural economics, risk, perception, framing, anchoring. Understanding the drivers of what's important in culture. Okay, so how about an open-ended question then? When poor people in a country have a problem, when women of a particular country have a problem, when a marginalised group of people in a country have a problem, whose responsibility is it to fix? Perhaps there's too much vested money in the prison systems, perhaps too much vested interest to criminalise, to keep ghettos where they are, to keep people poor. It seems to me that keeping people poor is an introducer, or to be a referral agent to the courts and incarceration complex. Likewise, casinos. They're just not quite introducers to debt collection agencies. They move in with all sorts of promises, jobs, attractions, tax revenues, but the high rollers prefer the established grounds. They don't actually turn up. They prefer the locations where those other things can go on just around the corner, just over the fence, just over the state line, just hop on that boat to international waters close by. Staff in those casinos slowly replaced with slot machines, revenues decline, and the taxes perhaps never meet any state-granted tax incentives. So, the casinos basically come in, get a huge tax benefit, don't employ people, suck up all the money, crime moves in, and so on and so on. We've seen it all before. So, well done Donald Trump for bankrupting those 3 casinos. Pity they didn't close afterwards. Nice try. So there's no value creation in this, and in terms of keeping people poor, incentivises criminal behaviour. It's locking up people for profit. It's an absurd incentive scheme. Turns out, as I say, investing money into social service programs that sees less crime, less people in jail, sees increased education levels, sees higher employment, sees higher tax returns, sees benefit to the community, seems a lift in schools and qualities of education. It sees a 5 or 6 times return on investment. Yeah, with that kind of return, you've got to ask, why is it not being done? people in predictable conditions do predictable things. If we change the conditions, we change the outcome. Nudges. Few resources here, few resources there. The rest takes care of itself over time. So in summary, all this, what we've gone through, socio-economics, legacies from history, is tricky, is complicated. Of course, people want simple answers, and saying low IQ or genetics is an answer. It is simple, but it might not even be true. It fixes nothing except to provide a convenient curtain to hide behind and absolve oneself from social and moral responsibility. What I say to those who do this: try harder. No, because it does no good. There's no explicit measurable metric around what try harder is, and I've done the self-help circuit to know all about try and do or do not do, often quoted of a little green sage that expressed things in reverse Polish. Syntax joke. Yet, such black and white thinking, do or don't do, well, didn't another Jedi state that only Sith Lords think in absolutes? Anyway, fantasy and space operas and mythical figures aside, let's get back on it.